Chapter 5. May City was in a warm region, geographically speaking. It wouldn't drop below freezing until January, if at all, and snow was not a winter guarantee. Nick was from December, which lived up to its name. Optimists might call it a winter wonderland, while pessimists, and Nick, called it a piss-and-mud slushy for half the year. So while May City natives shivered in a mild breeze and started wearing layers before the leaves even began to turn, Nick was fine until the nights dropped below 50 degrees. About halfway through November, it finally got chilly enough that Nick had to add his black wool coat to his usual outfit. Riding a motorcycle at the crack of dawn in 40 Fahrenheit foggy dampness was a little much, even for him. His helmet kept his face out of it, but the wind stung. He bundled up and set out extra early one morning, meaning to run to the bakery for coffee and pastries for the whole office. He could be a nice boss like that, right? It had nothing to do with the fact that sometimes he ran into Vash there. He parked up in his usual spot, pulled his helmet off, and ran a hand through his hair. There weren't many people out this early. A couple of shop workers were unlocking doors. A man in a white jacket strolled past the funeral home, looking like he might be heading for the diner. A glance across the street told Nick that he had done the almost impossible, beaten Vash to work. That rusty death trap of a car wasn't there yet. Nick went inside the funeral home, set his stuff down under his desk, booted up his computer, and headed back outside with his coat still on and his hands in his pockets. Over at the garden center, the rusty old sedan was just rounding a corner to the parking lot. Nick could see the silhouettes of two people in the front seats. He bit the inside of his lip, then decided he might as well see if Vash wanted to walk with him down to the bakery. He headed across the street, pausing to avoid an early morning driver with an out-of-state license plate who seemed to be in a real hurry to get somewhere. Nick was only a few yards from the car when the front doors both creaked open. He'd only ever seen Knives that one time at Elendira's shop. He'd forgotten how uncannily similar the brothers looked. Seeing them next to each other was truly surreal. It looked like Knives was paler purely because he stayed out of the sun. Otherwise, their skin tone was identical. And their shades of blonde were definitely not the same, but other than that, it was like looking at clones. Vash turned and saw Nick coming. He had the straps of a duffel bag in his right hand. He started to grin and raised his free hand to wave. His left hand, bare. Nick took the last few steps by inertia, eyes immediately fixed on Vash's upraised hand. It was a mix of metal and plastic, mostly black, scuffed, scratched, and well used. For the long moment that Nick got to look at it, he saw that the thin mechanical wrist extended down inside Vash's sleeve. Nick couldn't tell where it stopped. How much arm was missing? The bubble burst when Knives barked, "Hey!" Nick stopped in his tracks and blinked. His gaze flicked to Knives, whose burning glower looked like it could level a city, and then back to Vash, who was laughing a little too hysterically and busy trying to get the bag onto his shoulder so he could stick his hands in his pockets. "Hi," said Vash. "Go away," said Knives. "Knives," Vash tried, hyper-cheerful. "He was staring," Knives said through gritted teeth. "Well, you're making a big deal." Vash shrugged. "Come on, it's nothing. Morning, Nick." "Morning," Nick replied out of habit. I'm just going over to Cheryl's. I was going to ask if you wanted to get coffee, or—" Immediate interest flashed in Vash's eyes, but Knives bluntly said, "We've got a lot to do this morning, sorry." "Oh," said Vash, face falling a little. "Yeah, we had coffee at home already, but thanks." "Okay," said Nick, being made profoundly uncomfortable by Knives' continuous glare. Did the man ever blink? "That's fine, it's fine." He thought furiously about whether he should say something about the handless elephant in the room. But what to say? Plenty of people were missing a hand. People were born without hands. It would be nothing to remark upon at all, except that Vash had definitely been hiding it for 3 months, and Knives was now looking at Nick like he'd like to slice his eyes out for having dared to catch a glimpse of Vash's prosthetic. Nick settled on taking a couple of steps backwards, starting to turn to leave, and making himself sound cheerful when he said, "Black's a good color on you." "What the fuck?" he berated himself immediately. What the actual fuck was that line? This is a nightmare. He hunched his shoulders, dying inside. Behind him, Vash made a weird noise that Nick assumed to be a strangled laugh. "Thanks," Vash called back. Then Knives said something to him which Nick didn't catch, and Vash replied, "Oh, shut up!" half an octave too high. The next night, Nick was staying late in the funeral home to clean up after a visitation. Brad was taking the deceased back down to cold storage until the burial service the next day, and Jessica was bustling around cleaning up tiny plates which had once held tiny cookies. Not everyone wanted their open casket viewings catered. Eating around a corpse could feel kind of strange, but sometimes a family would go in for small sweets and ginger ale, something inoffensive. Nick found the excessive etiquette exhausting, but Conrad Chapel Funeral Home definitely served a particular flavor of middle-class, largely white, largely Catholic clientele, and it showed. Nick just knew he wanted a ton of booze at his own funeral. Brad came back upstairs. Livio appeared from the carport door. Everyone was in one room, not too busy for once. Finally, after having held in every question he'd thought of for 24 hours straight, Nick broke and asked, "Okay, did anyone else know Vash had a prosthetic hand?" Jessica's mouth fell open. Nick took that as a no. "What?" she squeaked. "Oh my God, what happened?" Livio whistled. "Seriously?" he asked. Nick shook his head. "You people are useless." "Yeah," Brad said suddenly. All eyes turned to him. He glared back. "What? I knew." "Since when?" Jessica asked, affronted. "Before you started here," Brad said, looking uncomfortable. "It's not a big deal." Nick said, "No, I know it isn't. It's obvious he doesn't want people to know." "That's why I didn't say anything," Brad said, looking pointedly at Nick. Nick flushed. He went back to collecting trash into a big garbage bag. "Fair," he muttered. "But really, what happened?" Jessica demanded, looking distraught. Brad shrugged. "Didn't ask." "But—" "It's none of our business, Jess," Brad said, and his tone brooked no further discussion. They finished cleaning up in silence. Jessica finally left for home, unusually subdued. Ravi arrived to take over the prep room. Livio headed back outside with a shop vac to give the hearse a once-over before tomorrow's burial. Nick gathered all the trash to take to the dumpster, ready to head home and crash as soon as this was done. Brad walked past him and said, "Hey, come talk in the kitchen for a minute." Nick blinked after him. He put down the bag he'd been about to leave with, and cautiously headed down the hall. In the kitchen, Brad was leaning against the counter, arms crossed. Nick instinctively crossed his own right back. This felt very confrontational, and he didn't know how to take it. "What?" Nick asked. Brad blew out a sigh through his nose and looked off to Nick's side, picking a point on the wall to glare at. "This ain't appropriate to say to a boss," he said. "So I'm not saying anything as a coworker, okay? This is, I guess, as a friend." Some of the tension left Nick's shoulders. "Okay," he said cautiously. "Are you gonna... could you just... Ugh." Brad pinched the bridge of his nose. "Jessica has a huge crush on that guy, Sovereign, but she ain't ever gonna do anything about it. She's too embarrassed. She already told me, so..." "So what?" Nick said, shifting weight from foot to foot. He tightened his arms defensively. Why hadn't he seen it before? Now that Brad laid it out, it couldn't be more obvious. "You want her to take her shot, or..." Brad actually blushed. Nick peered at him, amazed that his ears could get that red. "No," he muttered. She's a grown-up. Doesn't matter to me what she does or doesn't... Listen, that's not the point." He huffed. "I just wanted to say, could you just ask the man out already? I've been around one person pining for forever. I just about can't deal with two." Nick actually took a step back. His heart sped up. "I don't..." he tried, weakly. "God," Brad said, burying his face in one broad hand. "Don't even try. I'm supportive or whatever. You don't have to deny stuff around me. Besides, Livio's way worse than you for being crass. You're just worse for..." Brad waved his hand vaguely. "Whatever this is you're doing. It couldn't be more obvious Sovereign basically wants to marry you already, so get over it and ask him." Heart pounding, Nick found his back against a wall. He glanced over at the door and considered escaping, but Brad had a point. Maybe all Nick needed was the push from someone else telling him to get his head out of his ass. It wasn't like any stars were crossed here. There were no obstacles except the fact that Nick was always too far inside his own head to realize what was good for him. Well, that, and... "I'm not sure how," Nick said slowly, feeling out the problem for the first time. Brad sighed. "What?" "Okay, definitely not coworkers, right?" Nick asked. "This is just friendly advice time." "Sure," Brad said, giving him a wary look. He's always so happy. Friends with everyone, but like exactly the same degree of friends with everyone, which is close, really close. I'm not saying you're wrong, but even if he does like me, what's asking him out even look like? I ask him out to eat all the time. That's not special. I barely have a life outside here, and he doesn't seem to either. Not sure where our common ground is, to be honest. Brad stared at him. You want date ideas? What? No, Nick glared. I can plan a fucking... He caught himself. He tried not to curse inside the building. It helped to have a hard line about where to tone down his innate personality. He shook himself. No, it's not that. It's just... He grimaced. Never mind. It doesn't matter. I heard you. I'll take it under advisement. He turned. Hang on, Brad said. Nick looked back. Brad was staring fixedly at the door, clearly trying to pretend he wasn't giving his boss dating advice in the middle of the night, one floor above a big room full of dead people. Ask him somewhere alone, Brad muttered. He spreads out to fill a room, you know. If there's other people around, he'll always be divided. Don't go somewhere with people. Go walk in a park or something, just to talk. Nick stared. Brad was absolutely right. Nick hadn't realized he was such a good study of character, considering he pretended he barely knew people's names. Yeah, Nick said. Sounds like a plan. Okay, Brad said, pushing away from the counter. I'll take the trash out. Just head home. Nick didn't argue. Nick was going to wait until the weekend, but Vash didn't give him the luxury of spending another 2 days agonizing over what to say. The day after Brad's ultimatum, during Nick's mid-morning smoke break, he was so deep in his own head that he didn't even notice Vash jogging across the street until a bright voice said, "Morning, Smokestack!" Nick jumped. He focused on the world around him and caught Vash's last steps in his direction. Excuse me? What about Chimney? Vash offered. No way. I don't get a nickname. No fair. Life ain't fair, Spiky. Fine. Vash leaned against the wall next to him. I haven't had a chance till now, but I wanted to apologize for my brother. Huh? Oh. Nick took a pull on his cigarette. It's fine. He's a lot, though, isn't he? Kinda intense, Vash agreed. And way overprotective. I told him I didn't really appreciate how he talked to you. You didn't have to do that. I did stare. Sorry about that, by the way. Vash shrugged easily. If I choose to cover it up, I can't really object when it takes people by surprise. Still, I respect your choice either way, Nick said. I can consider it stricken from the record. He gestured to his temple. There, forgotten. Vash laughed ruefully. No, don't forget, then this'll just happen all over again. He pulled his hands out of his pockets and tugged the thin brown glove off his left. Here, intentional and everything. He waved at Nick with the prosthetic. Oh, you don't gotta, Nick drawled, but he didn't seriously try to argue. Looks fancy, he added, giving the hand an appraising look. Kinda. Vash curled and uncurled the fingers. Fancier than the last two. I've had this one for a couple years. It's definitely the best one yet. So, this isn't recent, Nick said. Oh, no, going on 15 years. I was really open about it at first back home, but then Knives and I moved to May and I just got so tired of giving the same old explanations, especially to customers. It felt too rude to put up a big sign that said, "Stop asking about the hand," and gloves are cheap. Understandable, Nick said. I really wouldn't have guessed. You're good with it. Practice makes perfect, Vash said, grinning. Not great for fine motor skills, but works fine for heavy lifting. Plus, I was right-handed anyway. Didn't have to relearn the hard stuff. Southpaw myself, Nick said, waggling the cigarette in his left hand. I'd have been in trouble. Well, I recommend not going near any combine harvesters then, Vash joked. They've got a taste for human flesh. Nick winced. That doesn't sound like a fun time. Yeah, I don't recommend it, Vash said, but his expression was clear and open, bright with amusement, no hint of hidden pain. Maybe it really was so long ago that he was no longer bothered by it. Nick stubbed his cigarette out on his boot heel, then put a hand over his heart. I swear to the Lord Almighty I won't get in fistfights with any farm equipment in this life, he said. Vash giggled. No other word fit that particular laugh. Nick had never known a man who put on so few pretenses, who didn't make any effort to self-censor, to sound cooler, to put on airs. Vash was such a contradiction. The most unreservedly honest person Nick could ever remember meeting, while also being as smooth and impenetrable as a glass wall. What was behind there? It wasn't possible to be flawlessly happy. It wasn't that Nick thought Vash should perform his negative emotions. Far from it. Nick was impressed by how much pressure Vash seemed able to confidently shoulder, but Nick ached to at least be let in on the secret. To be one of the few people Vash could confide in that he wasn't okay, whenever that happened. Nick swallowed. Vash. Yeah? This is easy. What are you, 15 again? I was wondering if you'd want to go for a walk sometime. Around the park downtown? Not that I don't love our little chats, but sometimes 10 minutes at a time doesn't cut it. Vash peered at him. What about lunch? I took way over my break time last week, you know. Kite was about to shit a brick when I got back. Yeah, Nick said, heart thumping, feeling stupid. Yeah, I know, but I just wanted to, I don't know, change it up. Have time. Without work hanging over us, or... He looked up at Vash, who was a little bit pink in the cheeks, but Nick couldn't tell what his expression was saying. Reluctance? Fear? But then Vash smiled, a smile that just about reached his eyes, although something about it still looked troubled, and he said, Yeah, Nick, I'd like that a lot. Mixed messages. Nick swallowed hard again and said, What are you doing Saturday? It's my Brad-enforced mandatory day off. Vash chuckled. Well, I was gonna be working, but I don't have to be. Shit, I didn't mean you needed to change your whole schedule. Well, said Vash, you're just lucky you have people around who force you to take days off. I know I should take more breaks, but... His smile faltered. I don't really have anything better to do, you know? Might as well work. So is the park something better to do? Whoops, Freud. Stay out of this. Vash's grin came back. Yeah, he said. I think it might be. Saturday morning, Vash texted, I'm riding to work with knives. Only have the one car. Let me know when you're coming. So Nick showered. Cold water for the latter half. He told his imagination he didn't have time for it right now, and got presentable by late morning. Noontime walk in the park. Why not? He almost put on the same uniform as every day before he remembered he didn't have to go to work, and he could try something different out on Vash if he wanted to. Still, most of his closet was black. He waffled for a long time and then pulled out his only non-black shirt, a gray Henley. Checked himself out. Yeah, he hadn't put on a visible gut from the more or less sedentary job, yet, and the Henley showed off his neck and clavicle. He undid another button on it before he could overthink himself, threw on his black wool coat and leather gloves, and headed out, shooting Vash a text as he went. He parked near the garden center's side door, pulled his helmet off, and saw Vash standing there with an expression like he hadn't eaten in weeks, and Nick was his favorite food. Guess that makes me donuts, Nick thought stupidly, feeling distinctly flushed from Vash's eyes on him. But it passed in a heartbeat, and Vash grinned like normal, loping towards him. He was wearing different clothes, too, which made Nick's stomach do a weird twist and flop. Both of them dressing nicer felt very date-like. Vash's nice duds were mostly just as usual, but without dirt smudges, except for a blood-red, double-breasted peacoat, which was sharp as hell. Nice look, Nick said. Vash kind of opened his arms at himself like, yeah, look at me. I know, I never get to wear it, he said. I don't want to get it dirty, which kind of excludes everything I do. Nick chuckled. True. He jerked his head behind himself. You ready to go? Yeah, ridden one of these before? When I was 5, Vash said. In a sidecar. Nick laughed at the mental image. Okay, it's not hard. And here. He only had one helmet, was the thing. He held it out to Vash. Vash took it, but immediately frowned and asked, Where's yours? Nick pulled his sunglasses out of his pocket and slipped them on. Safety goggles, he said, deadpan. Vash glared at him. I don't like this, he said. Sorry, said Nick, honestly. I don't usually have passengers. I'll invest in another one if you want to go for joyrides more often. Vash's lips twitched in a smile that was clearly fighting against his desire to be disapproving. This is going to be hell on my hair, isn't it? He sighed, looking at the helmet. Not my fault you style it like a punk. Vash huffed, flipped Nick a momentary bird, and lifted the helmet over his head. He fumbled with it for a second before Nick pulled him down towards him and did up the strap himself. He patted Vash's shoulder. There you go, he said. Both daft and punk. Shut up, Vash said, muffled. Nick scooted up on his seat to give Vash room to swing his leg over. It was a snug fit. Nick's seat wasn't really meant for two, but they were both pretty slender, and it worked as long as Vash sat close. "Hold on to me," Nick said. "Shoulders or middle?" Vash asked, over the sound of Nick revving the engine. "However you feel most secure," Nick called. "I don't mind." Vash's arms wrapped around his waist, and Nick had told a lie because actually he did mind, and this was exactly what he'd wanted. But also, maybe, a problem. The bike purred under him as he pushed off into the road. Vash's grip tightened reflexively at the forward motion. Wind ruffled through his uncovered hair. Nick was going to have to think some deeply unsexy thoughts all the way to the park, or he'd be in real trouble once they got there. Except, in the end, he didn't have to. Turned out that highway speeds without a helmet, even slow 45 miles per hour in-town highway speeds, really sucked. The sunglasses were a good call, but his face still stung like crazy when he pulled to a stop in the small parking lot next to the park, and unwanted erections were the last thing on his mind. He rifled through all his pockets as soon as they stopped, hunting for chapstick. Vash slid off the bike behind him, pulled off the helmet, and shook his head like a dog. His hair was indeed a mess. He scrubbed a hand through it, pulling it up from his scalp, but it mostly wilted again anyway. It made him look like he had the craziest bedhead Nick had ever seen, which did funny things to the pit of his stomach. Nick got up and took the helmet from him, locked it around the handlebars. "Looking good," he said. "Shut up," said Vash, giving up on his hair. He'd at least pulled it so it slouched in one direction, more or less. It looked cute. Vash could probably pull off one of those undercuts, with long on-top hair swept to the side. It would give Livio a heart attack. He'd cut his own hair like that when they were kids, using stolen safety scissors, and it had looked goofy and atrocious. Nick's heart sped up a little as he remembered what they were here for. He nodded towards the gravel path away from the parking lot, which led towards a small lake at the center of the park. "Want to see if there's ducks?" he asked. Vash smiled. They fell into step next to each other, shoulders apart by a few inches. It was a nice day, if chilly. The sun wasn't blinding, mostly hidden by thin clouds that left the sky a diffused white. A light breeze rustled the treetops, but didn't quite reach down to smack them in the face. Gray squirrels were absolutely everywhere, sometimes fighting each other, mostly just madly scrambling to collect all the acorns that had been falling recently. Vash paused and angled to walk off the path. Nick followed. "Where you going?" "That's a pecan," Vash said, pointing at a tree ahead. "Big one. I just wanted to see." He stooped once they were under the branches, scupped some leaves aside, and started plucking things from the ground. In seconds he had a handful of smooth oblongs, light brown with dark stripes. He straightened, grinning at Nick, and squeezed 2 nuts together in his right hand until they cracked. He held out his hand. "Want one?" Nick blinked and took one of the cracked things. "This isn't tainted with squirrel piss or something?" Vash snorted. "They eat these too. Why would they do that?" he said, cracking another one. He tugged his right glove off and started carefully wiggling the shell pieces. In a heartbeat he had a completely intact, plump, russet-colored pecan, which he popped into his mouth. "This is the perfect time for them," he said around it. "Just fallen, haven't had a chance to dry out yet." He bent over and picked up a few more, filling his pockets. Nick looked at the nut. He couldn't see how to get the shell off the meat without obliterating it. The meat itself was wrinkled like a brain, and the shell stuck into it at odd angles. But he gave it a fair shot, and managed to get a couple of shards of edible pecan out of the shell. He nibbled one uncertainly. Mildly oily, rich nuttiness burst over his tongue, way more than he was used to tasting from a pecan. Which, granted, he'd only really had in pie form before now. "Shit," he said. "That's good." He looked up to see Vash watching him with that dopey smile. He flushed. Vash held out his hand. "You're really ripping that thing up. Here," Vash said, half laughing, and Nick huffed and passed the pecan back over. Vash fiddled with it for a moment, and then handed Nick the meat, sans shell. "I'm gonna guess you don't buy nuts in the shell?" Vash asked as they headed back toward the path. "You could have stopped at buy nuts," Nick said. "I don't really screw around with things that aren't already ready to eat, preferably in noodle form." "Aw, that's too bad. I like cooking." Vash shelled more pecans and handed Nick every other one. "So does Knives. I have to let him have the kitchen most of the time, though." "Why?" "Oh, he hates food waste, and we grow more than we can eat, so he's always canning stuff. We sell it at the shop. It does pretty well." Nick blinked and remembered the whole wall of hand-labeled jars of preserves up at the front counter. "Damn, that's a lot of work." "Yeah," Vash said enthusiastically, "that I'm not doing. I just get to reap the rewards. It's great. He ate another pecan and held up the shell. I like this, too. I guess people call it urban foraging or whatever. I like knowing what's edible around me. Back home it was just normal for most people, but in May it's like a fun party trick. Where's home? Nick asked. Middle of nowhere, Midwest. Flyover country. I grew up on a farm. He flapped his left elbow. Obviously, I guess. Not obviously, Nick said. I don't know anything about farming. I'm sorry that happened at your home, then. That had to be rough. Vash was quiet for a moment, focused on a stubborn pecan. Finally, he said, Yeah, it was. He trailed off, shook his head. Never mind. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? He put his smile back on and handed Nick the next nut. Nick wanted to argue. Sometimes what didn't kill you left you weak and struggling and in pain, and that wasn't a moral failing. Needing help, needing time, needing safety in which to heal and rebuild strength, none of those were a failing. Instead, he said, I grew up in December. Too cold for a lot of crops, I think. But I went ice fishing a couple times, and once I caught a perch good enough to keep. So I guess I have hunted and killed my own dinner once. He gave Vash a lopsided smirk. It was bony. I seem to remember wanting chicken nuggets instead. Vash laughed. Those tiny, fine lines by his eyes crinkled up. Nick could stare at his face all day. God, why was he so... They'd reached the lake. It was more of a glorified pond, easy to see all the way around its edges. A sign declared that it was stocked with fish, but that fishing was prohibited except with a license on certain days. Nick wondered who enforced that. There were a tiny handful of people out and about. It was too chilly for kids to be out daring each other to swim, which was also prohibited, or for families to set up picnics. A gaggle of teens sat around one of the shabby picnic tables, laughing at someone's phone. Out on the water, half a dozen ducks paddled around aimlessly, bobbing and diving. Vash, Nick said, heart-thumping, I want to ask something. And if I'm out of line, just strike it from the record, okay? Vash furrowed his brow. Okay, you sound serious. I'm not, Nick trailed off. Actually, I am. In all seriousness. He took a hand out of his pocket and scratched the side of his nose. Do you like me? Vash's eyebrows went up. No, he said. I usually spend all my free time hanging out with people I hate. He couldn't deadpan like Nick could. His sarcasm was obvious. All right, ass, Nick said and huffed. Listen, I like you a lot. As in, if you wanted to go out sometime to get drinks or see a movie, I would want that. He gritted his teeth. God, that was painful. Sure, it had been a long time since he'd asked somebody out, but that was no excuse. He glanced over at Vash, who looked... What was that? Overwhelmed? Upset? Whatever was happening in his head was intense either way. Vash opened his mouth and Nick braced for the no, all but heard it out loud. Yeah, said Vash. Me too. At least he's gentle. Maybe this won't make things weird between... Wait, what? The cognitive dissonance of Vash saying yes like he was going to a funeral threw Nick for a hard loop. He stared at Vash, confused. Vash took a deep breath. I really, really like you. I would date you in a heartbeat, I would. Ugh. He scrubbed a hand through his hair again. But, Nick prompted. But, Vash agreed. He sighed. I hate this. I hate saying this out loud. Fuck. It's knives, okay? Nick blinked. Pardon? Vash shut his eyes. There's just a lot going on. Extenuating circumstances. He needs help right now and I need to be with him and... Yeah, I want to walk away from his problems and spend all my time with you. I couldn't want that more. But he's my brother. He's my only family and I worked really hard to... Vash looked out over the lake, eyes bright. I almost lost him once. I can't let go of him again. I'm so sorry. Hey, said Nick, because Vash was definitely about to cry. No, I'm sorry too. Come here. He opened his arms in offering. Vash stepped into the hug and Nick held him firmly, arms full of red coat and skinny frame. It was the first time he'd felt Vash's body, thinner than he'd anticipated, but hard everywhere with muscle. Nick let his eyes slide shut and turned his face toward Vash's neck, savoring the chance to smell his stupid hair product up close, the rough wool of the peacoat rasping against his stubbly chin. It wasn't a brief one-and-done hug. Vash held him like he thought he wouldn't get to again, breathing heavy and hitched against Nick's shoulder. Nick couldn't tell if he was actually crying or just resisting it. He rubbed a hand up and down the center of Vash's back. Finally, Vash pulled back. His eyes were still bright, but his face was dry. He sniffed hard and scrubbed his wrist under his nose, stepping back from Nick. "Sorry," he said. I'm disgusting." "You're not," Nick said, more sharply than he meant to. Vash blinked and looked at him. "Sorry, I just mean, I get it. I get family." "Oh." Vash sniffed again and coughed to clear his throat. "Got a lot? Family, I mean?" "None," Nick said, and Vash froze, stared at him. Nick shrugged one shoulder, suddenly uncomfortable. "I mean, kind of. There's the boys' home I grew up in. And Livio." "The driver?" "Small world. He spent time at the same orphanage as me." "Oh." Vash kept looking at him, eyes searching and soft. "Yeah, Knives and I are orphans. Twice, I guess. We were adopted, but too young to remember any birth family. And Rem and Alex, our parents, they're both gone now. So, just us." "So I get it," Nick insisted. "When you don't have much, you give everything for what you do have." Vash's eyes were wide, so vulnerable. Nick's stomach flipped. He'd wished to be inside Vash's glass wall, closer to him than held at arm's length, and now that he was, he remembered that you were supposed to be careful what you wished for. It hurt to see Vash hurting. In the too long silence, Nick asked, "Is there anything I can do to help? With knives, I mean?" Vash bit his lip. Nick realized what he'd said, how it could be taken. "Not that I'm trying to rush him out of the way as an obstacle, or—" Vash took a step closer. His hand came up and hovered over Nick's chest. "Can I?" he asked, unclear. "Yes," Nick said, not knowing what he was agreeing to. Vash kissed him. It was so good, immediately so good. Nick didn't mean to deepen it so fast, but his lips parted in startlement, and Vash licked them lightly, and that was that. They both tasted like pecans. Vash liked something sweet behind that, probably soda, and Nick still a little bit like coffee, hopefully not too much like nicotine. He drew in a deep breath through his nose, stepping closer, until they were almost chest to chest, Vash's tongue barely sliding over his, Vash's hand on the side of Nick's face. Nick put his hands around Vash's waist and tried not to pull him too close. It was a public park, after all. After an eternity, Vash pulled back and blinked, dazed, too close. He leaned back a little more. He said softly. Nick licked his bottom lip. "Mixed messages, Spiky," he said. "Damn it. Sorry." Vash let out a shaky breath. "I think I just need to think. I need a little while to figure out what to do. Can you give me a couple days?" "Couple days," Nick echoed. "Yeah." He instantly dreaded the next 2 days, because he was not going to be able to concentrate on a damn thing. But he said, "Whatever you need, Vash. If I can help, ask me. Please ask." He hoped he didn't sound too much like he was begging, which he definitely was. Vash nodded. His eyes went to Nick's mouth, and for a second Nick thought the tension was about to snap into another kiss. Vash definitely looked like he wanted to. But then Vash stepped backwards and Nick let go of his waist. Vash glanced around. Nick remembered that other people existed. But a quick look told him nobody had noticed or cared. The teens were still cackling at something online, heads all down in a huddle. Nick coughed, stuck his hands in his pockets. "So," he said. "Yeah," Vash said. His easy, tension-smoothing persona shook back into place, and he gave Nick a silly grin. "Oops, made the day weird." "Your face is weird," Nick replied easily, and Vash's smile widened. Nick peered over at the pond. "Can you feed pecans to ducks?" "No!" Vash squawked, immediately outraged. "They'll choke." "Not the way I shell 'em," Nick said. "Do you one better," said Vash. "I bet I can get a squirrel to eat out of my hand." "Bullshit," Nick grinned. "Try it, Disney princess." "I will." "Bet's on who's paying for lunch." "Oh, lunch is a part of this whole deal now, huh?" Nick put a hand on his stomach. I'm but a poor, starving orphan, he said. Vash smacked his shoulder and Nick staggered back, laughing. I get a squirrel, you pay, Vash said. Italian. I want tiramisu. Fine. If you can't sweet-talk one of those rabbit rats, ramen's on you. Vash made a face. Good ramen. I know a place. They have seaweed salad and everything, said Nick. For you wacky vegetarians. Fishitarians, whatever you are. Vash exaggerated a gag. Okay, fine. Lot riding on this. He pulled a handful of pecans out of his pocket and looked around for a likely target. The rest of the afternoon couldn't have been more perfect. Vash did, in fact, manage to hypnotize some wildlife, but not a squirrel. A pigeon pecked its way over to him, quickly followed by a dozen of its friends. Nick laughed wildly at him from a distance, while Vash tried to shoo off birds and leave sweet offerings for the squirrels. The birds weren't having it. Finally, Vash gave up and came back to Nick, pouting, all out of pecans. Nick ruled that Vash had won, which brought him right back around. Another bike ride later, Vash's hair gel was completely unsalvageable, but Nick liked it down anyway. It just about brushed the tops of his ears and framed his face in a flyaway shag cut. He teased Vash that he looked like a 2000s emo boy band member. He just needed a ton of eyeliner. Vash licked his finger and tried to stick it in Nick's ear. Lunch felt almost normal, except for the different food, the fancier place, Vash's special red coat he never got to wear, and the lingering memory of pressure against Nick's lips and a promise of a better answer soon. Vash made happy noises over his tiramisu that affected Nick very differently now that he'd tasted Vash's mouth once. He was glad for the cold wind that slapped some sense back into him on the drive back to the garden center. Sure about this? I can take you home, Nick said. Nah, I'll get some work done and go home with knives, Vash said, hopping off the bike. He patted its seat. I like her, by the way. Angelina never does me wrong, Nick said, not adding, except for when she breaks down 3 times a year. Vash handed Nick his helmet. They paused for a long moment, looking at each other. Vash tentatively reached over and put a hand next to Nick's on the bike's handlebar and leaned down. This kiss was more tentative, but it laid waste to Nick's insides all the same. Vash tasted like coffee liqueur and sweet cream. Nick made an almost involuntary sound, because it was so unfair that the taste had to be so brief. Vash stood up, his ears very pink. I promise I can tell you something by Monday, he said, as serious as he ever got. Nick put his foot up on the heel rest. Can't wait, he said. Vash left. Nick sat there for a moment too long, staring into the middle distance, trying to calm down. At length, he shook himself back to reality. Down the block, he noticed a blue car with the driver sitting still, watching him. He looked vaguely familiar. Someone Nick had seen around the neighborhood before, but who Vash hadn't gotten around to introducing, he supposed. Nick hurriedly pulled the helmet down and took off, embarrassed to be seen sitting there pining like some lovesick kid. 2 fucking days. Later the same evening, Nick's phone buzzed. He ignored it, focused on his beer and the reality show he was barely watching, until it buzzed again. It occurred to him that it could be Vash. He snatched it up. Poker night, bitches. I am so sorry. That was meant for a different group chat. Meryl Strife. Nick snorted. He texted back, It's fine. I answer to bitches. Her typing ellipses appeared and disappeared 3 times. Finally, she sent, Okay then. Poker night, bitches? He laughed. Considered it. It would be his first time over at Strife and Thompson's without Vash there as connective tissue, but he liked them a lot and had hoped he could get to know them better on his own time anyway. Besides, what was he going to do around here except mope, drink, and continue to not care about rich idiots doing house renovations? Should I bring anything? He asked. Just a winner's attitude and loser's luck, she said. Damn, he liked her. He did stop at a corner store for a 6-pack of decent beer, though, because he wasn't a heathen and felt bad about showing up empty-handed. He wondered how much drinking was likely and whether he should have taken a cab or a rideshare, but then he figured he could still take one home if he needed to, and the bike would barely be a block from work. He'd be fine. He'd already been told about the existence of a back entrance, so he parked in the alley behind the line of shops and knocked on a yellow-painted door that had no S&T Books signage around it. Millie greeted him. Mr. Preacher Man! She cried, flinging her arms around him. She smelled like she'd already gotten started. He patted her back. Definitely not, he said firmly. You dress just like my... she hiccuped. Family's old pastor did. Come on in, we have chips and dip. He held up the beer as an offering and she dragged him inside, shutting the door behind him. It was fantastic. Meryl and Millie had friends who were still in the insurance business, and no one blew off steam like office workers released from any and all bounds of etiquette. And once Nick got dealt into the poker game, an off-duty cop named Mary Ann called every one of his bluffs and had the luck of a demon on the draw. They played penny ante. He lost $5. It was a thorough ass-kicking. "You want to play for different stakes?" Mary Ann asked with a leer, and got a few wolf whistles and laughs from the unbuttoned Bernardelli's Insurance Society entourage. "Sorry," Nick said with his best roguish grin. "Unavailable at the moment. Got my eye on a different blonde." He waggled an eyebrow, earning some more oohs and whoops. "Anyone I know?" asked Mary Ann. "Maybe," he said. "But I don't know you." She grinned wolfishly. A hand landed on Nick's shoulder. "Hey," said the terse voice of Meryl Shrife. "Come in the kitchen for a second?" "Sure," he said, getting up. Maneuvering out from around the crowded sofas was a bit of a pain. He'd already witnessed a couple of people jumping over the backs of them to land on the seats, but he didn't think he was that kind of friend just yet. He followed Meryl up one short flight of steps to the next floor. The bookstore was at the bottom of a tall, narrow townhouse, and Meryl and Millie lived up top. The in-between floor was more of a gray area, a place open to friends, but not customers. There was an open-plan kitchen and common room right off the stairs, much less cramped than the game room below. Millie was already laid out, snoring gently, on a long sofa set up for watching a flat-screen TV by the windows. Meryl went to the stove, where she had a big pan, a couple of measuring spoons, some oil, and some popcorn kernels all laid out. "Sandra and Ben are staying for a movie later," she said, matter of fact. She adjusted items on the counter to be more perfectly aligned. "If anyone could stay awake," she added. "Sounds fun," Nick said, neutrally polite. "Okay," said Meryl, turning to face him. "Skip the part where you say nothing's up, because something's up. Explain—" She made a twirly gesture at his face. "Explain this." He raised an eyebrow. "What?" "This face," she said, frowning at him. "Distracted, weird, hiding something. And don't think I didn't hear what you said to Mary Ann." He sighed and leaned on the nearest counter, tipping his head back. "Fine. I asked Vash out, that's all. Not some kind of James Bond super spy shit." "I thought so," Meryl said, and smacked her fist into her open palm loud enough to make Nick jump. "You have a problem with that?" Nick asked, frowning. "No!" Meryl cried. "Hell no. It's the first good news I've heard about Vash in months. Wait, what did he say?" Nick crossed his arms. "Kinda nosy there, insurance girl." "Sorry," she huffed. "Sorry, I have to remember about boundaries, right." She chewed her bottom lip. "He just gets on my nerves so much," she said, as if that explained anything. "I'm lost," said Nick. "You lost me." Meryl groaned. "Okay. I've been friends with Vash pretty much since he moved here. Almost 4 years. And he doesn't take care of himself. He refuses. I don't know. I don't know what it is. He puts absolutely everyone else's needs over his own all the time. It drives me batshit." She scowled at the floor. It occurred to Nick that of all the many people Vash knew, Meryl was the only one he'd met who ever had anything negative to say about him, and everything she said rang true. He had a niggling suspicion in the back of his mind. "Meryl," he said slowly, "has he ever talked to you? Really talked? Let you in?" She looked up at him, appraising, and deflated with a little sigh. "A couple of times I thought we were getting somewhere," she said, with him being more honest, opening up. "But he shuts it down so fast. He ghosted me after the last time." She bit her thumbnail. "Didn't see him for such a long time until he turned up with you. I worry about him so much, that's all." Nick let out a long breath. "I get it," he said quietly. "And for the record, he didn't really answer when I asked. Said he had to figure some things out." Meryl put a hand over her face and groaned. "Am I setting myself up for a really bad time?" Nick asked, pained. "No," Meryl said without hesitation. "No, don't go there. I'm sorry. I shouldn't stick my nose in. It's just... he needs someone so badly." She looked up at Nick, eyes pleading. "If he won't let it be me as a friend, maybe it can be you as... whatever." She gestured vaguely at him and looked down. "I just want him to be okay." "So do I," said Nick. "And I believe that," Meryl said. "So, I hope it works. Good luck. Thank you, he said, really meaning it. There was an awkward pause. Do you want to stay for the movie? Meryl finally asked. No, I'm good, he said, smiling. Is that happening now, or is there time to try to win back some change? She raised an eyebrow. Why are you asking me? Marianne's the one who cleaned you out. You sure she isn't cheating, by the way? She's a cop. I think that makes her more likely to be cheating. I won't tell her you said that. Tell her whatever. ACAB, baby. Playing with fire. You want another beer? Yes, please.